Greetings, students. Welcome to class 3. We're continuing our conversation today on racism, and this is racism part 2. And so we're going to do a little bit more exploration in terms of really kind of building on what we talked about last week, where we just talked about some of the basic information around just understanding what privilege is and what racism it is, how it manifests. And today we're going to move forward in terms of that and then take a look at what are some of the implications as a result of this racism that continues to be a part of our very existence. So hang and bear with me. So when we start to think about what are the impacts of this racism, we know that it can exist and does exist at the micro, meso, as well as macro level. And so when we start to think institutionally and start to look at some of the broader institutions that we have to interface with on a daily basis: education, employment system, criminal justice systems, finance, housing, any number of the major institutions that we have to work with on a daily basis actually are some of the hotbeds for how institutional racism continues to be spread. And so as we look at this slide and we start to look at poverty, we look at who is living in poverty in our country, and you can start to see the stark reality of what we have here. And so if you are in the communities of colors, as you can see, their numbers are much higher, at least in 2014, and continues through to this day, than for those of us who are considered as European American or white. So just a result of what institutional racism looks like, if folks are not hiring people because of their background or nationality, then it furthers this gap in terms of being able to actually provide a livable income for the person as well as their family. So one of the fallout pieces as a result of institutional racism. When we start to look at the criminal justice system and we start to look at incarceration rates, and we look at this particular graph from the Prison Policy Initiative, it just kind of shows what happens based on where you are on the spectrum as it relates to race in this country in terms of who actually is incarcerated and at what rate. And you can see that this particular graph looks at the number of people per 100,000 people in that group. And as you can see that if you're a Caucasian, you're less likely to be jailed than if you were Latino or if you were Black. And also what's not on this chart is we don't have Native Americans, and that is also extremely high as well. When we start to look at things like median household income, we can see that, again, the implications and the intersectionality of racism as it rears its ugly head once again. And so these graphs really kind of illustrate the midpoint of income for households in our country. And as you can see, being in the groups of color, particularly Black or American Indian, Native Hawaiian, or Hispanic, your levels are lower than typically what is there for white non-Hispanic. Interestingly enough, there's a paradigm shift that's happening, because as you can start to see when we're looking at Asian populations, that their median household income has actually even outpaced those who are Caucasian. And we'll talk about that in more greater detail about why some of those kind of things are actually happening as well. Clear illustration here of Indian country in 1492. You know, and if you're remembering that date, that's kind of when Columbus discovered America. We see that literally 100% of this particular land was native land. 500 years later, after Columbus, the spots on the map that are your darker colored are the remaining portions of Indian land in this to this day. As you can see, there are several states where Indians have no land. If you look across the eastern seaboard, back through some of the lower parts of the Midwest, there are just simply no land that's actually owned by Native communities. The spots that you see that are in black are actually reservations. So these are lands that have been set aside for Native Americans. So as you can see, 500 years later, things have went in the reverse direction, and we all know about the genocide, the land grab, and the other things that happened as a result of policy here in America. Switching gears for a minute, and we'll spend a lot more time when I'm available in person to really talk more detailed about these particular concepts. So as you just saw some of the fallout and some of the things that happen as a result of racism in terms of the intersectionality that it has also with some of the other isms, but what really is at the heart of it in terms of the race are these particular concepts. And it's the internal racialized oppression, as well as the internal racialized superiority. So when we look at that, it's something compared to your yin and your yang. You have to have both to operate. And so it's a complex, multi-generational socialization system that teaches people based on where they are. If you're a person of color, it teaches you to live and accept negative societal definitions of self, as well as the internalized racial oppression really helps you take a look at what's happening from the standpoint of those who are white in our country, where they've been taught just the opposite and to live those greater definitions of self. So basically wanted just to spend a little bit of time today, didn't want to go into a great deal of detail, but just really looking at all of those particular parameters in terms of some of the implications for what happens as a result of racism in our country. There are some additional videos that are in this week's lesson that I'd like you to take a look at, and some readings as well that will further this particular discussion. So as always, do your readings, and I will see you at a later date. So take care.